Hi folks, I'm Tom Affolter. Welcome back to my lecture series on ANSI SQL. Today we're going to be talking about grouping data. And including in grouping data, we'll talk specifically about the group by clause as well as the having clause. And before I get started, I want to point out that when you talk to most people that are experienced in SQL, they're going to tell you that the group by clause is one of the more complex uh, type clauses in SQL to use or to understand. And I remember when I was getting involved, I probably wouldn't have argued too much about that. But I think I've got a way of explaining it to you, and if you understand the way that the group by statement works, you're really going to be able to harness that to your advantage, and it's really not that difficult. It's one of those statements, though, when you look at it as a whole, it looks complicated, but when you break it down, which I'm going to show you how to do, it is actually a very simple type statement to use. So up to this point, we've looked at data as individual rows with our standard select statement, where we're going back in and rewrite a select statement, give it a particular column or columns to return back, and we perhaps give it a where clause or an order by clause, but we're getting back individual records of data. We also took a look at using aggregate functions, and we found that we could come back with aggregate functions and we could assess that group of data. We might be able to go back in and write a select statement that says, give me all the data where the baseball player was born in Spokane, Washington. But if I wanted to know how many that was, I would do a count. The challenge with that, though, is that when we do the aggregate function, we don't know what the underlying data is. Or when we do a standard select statement, we have no idea what the aggregate function or what the total data returned back is. So we'd have to write it in two different statements. I'd have to write a select statement that account from the players from Spokane, Washington, and then I'd have to do a select statement to list those players back. And that's where the grouping statement comes in. I'm going to show you several different methods as far as how you might want to go back in and write your select statement. But what we're going to be able to do now is to go back in and say, I want this column of data returned, this column of data, and then I want an aggregate function returned with it. Now, to recall before, I told you that that wasn't possible. And it's not possible if you're using a standard select statement. But when you start using the group by statement, the world's going to open up a little bit. So let's take a look at this statement first of all. I've got a view out there that's already been created. We're going to talk about this view in our next section. We talk about joins, but nonetheless, what this view does is it lists out every player and the salary that player had for a given year. And we'll take a look at that in just a moment here. But what I want to have is I want to have all the Seattle players that played, or the Seattle Mariner players that played in the year 2014, I want to know their last name, their first name, and how much money they made in 2014 playing for Seattle. And when I get that data back, I'd like that data returned back to me in the last name and then the first name order. So basically that's what we've got right here. Let's take a look at this guy in action real quickly, and then we're going to come back and we'll assess him. So I'm going to grab that statement right here. I'm going to copy it. I'm going to jump over to my SQL, and I was in baseball, so let's go ahead and make sure I've got baseball. I've already logged in. Let's create a new query, and let me paste in that statement. So again, let me point out what we're asking it for. We're asking it for a last name, we're asking for a first name, we're asking for the sum that that particular player made, and we're going to call that column salary from VW player salaries. Now before we go on, let's take a look at that and see what that includes here. So I've had this open once before. VW player salaries. I'm just going to do a right click on it, treat it like a table, and I'm going to return back let's just take a look at the first 1,000 rows in that table. And you're going to see that what I've got is I've got a first name, I've got a last name, I've got the team that they played on for that given year, I've got the year they played and how much money they played in that respective year. And although it looks like Seattle players somewhat fall together, you'll see that they're kind of grouped together, but not so much so. The data goes back not too far. I believe the earliest data we have is back, for some teams I believe it's 2001, and I believe for some other teams it goes back as far as the 1980s. So we're not going to really depend heavily upon the salaries, because we certainly aren't going to have any salaries for players that played baseball back in the 1800s. Now, what this is a join, which we'll go into in the next section, between players and salaries. So let's not worry about it. Let's just imagine that this is a single table right now that we're dealing with. So let's come back over and take a look at what we've got here. So now, from that view, or we'll just say right now that table, because it could be a table, we're asking for the last name, then the first name, and the sum of the salary. Now, had we done this before, I got an error. Let's take a look at this. Let's execute it. And notice what it says down here. It says there's an error, level 16 error, with VW player salaries dot last. It says invalid in the list because it's not contained either in an aggregate function or a group by clause. Now remember, I just highlighted that one statement and I executed it. So it didn't see the rest of this code that existed down below, and the error I'm getting is just what we talked about in some of our earlier lectures, and that is I cannot combine an aggregate function with individual fields, because here I'm asking for individual fields to be returned, and how can I look at data individually and at the same time within the same statement try to look at a collective group of that same data? You can't do that. Even in the magic of SQL, you can't do that without doing a group by clause. So now let's take a look at what I've got here. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and run the entire statement, and let's see what comes up. So now what I've got, folks, let's look up here, is I have by last name every player that played in the year 2014 for Seattle and how much money they made for that respective year. So Felix Hernandez, for example, as a pitcher, made $22,857,000 in that 1 year. Pretty spectacular. It's a pretty amazing way we can assess our data, and we just started off with those individual tables which we created, in this case a view, but look where we've come so far. And really, if you stop and you think about what you can do as of this very moment, you could be sitting right now in a booth at ESPN while a live broadcast is going on and feeding them actual data of a game. That would totally be possible, because you could pull out any given team now. You might want to practice for a little bit of speed, obviously, but everything that's going on up there as far as asking for data, you can produce from the tables that we have right here. And it's important to understand that, because this is one of those kind of skills that's universal. Not only are you going to find yourself sitting perhaps in a booth, if you're lucky, at ESPN, but you could be behind a database engine doing nothing but writing SQL, or you could be writing an application program. So there's so many different things that you can do with this skill that we're covering right here. So let's continue on, and we're going to come back and we're going to reassess each individual piece of this statement so we can understand what's going on. So the group by clause, as we know, is a clause of the select statement. I just showed that to you. And really that group by clause, as we're going to take a look at, is a close kin to both that order by clause and the distinct clauses that we're going to see later. Group by columns now are going to be available with aggregate functions. What's going to be in the group by clause, as we're going to find out, isn't the aggregate function. So let's continue. Let's take a look at some examples that we see on the screen here, and I believe this is a fictitious table. So what we're doing here is we're asking now for a type of product. I want to know the average price of that product. I want to know what the total value of all of the prices are of that product, and then I want it grouped by type. So I want doodads listed. I want the average price of a doodad. I want the total sum of all the prices of the doodad, and then I go down, next one down might be a dillamajig, and the dillamajig would have an average price on it. But I might have a gazillion different dillamajigs in my database. So again, what this is doing now is it's allowing me to combine this type and this aggregate function together. But notice one thing here. Notice that the yellow here, whatever single column that I have within the type statement, whatever single column I have here has to be included within my group by statement down below. So at this particular point now, notice I'm not going to put any aggregate functions within my group by statement. I'm only going to put the individual columns down here. Notice down in this next statement down below, I've got a select statement, and let's see, the fictitious table here is a table called sales. So we're assuming now that we have sales, and I want to get all the sales for any respective state that exists out there. So I want all the sales for Washington and Oregon and California and Alabama, but I want them separated out, and I want how much total sales were made for that respective state. So I know that at some point I have a column called state and I have a column called sales out there, and I want to group all of those together that might exist within that sales table. Now also notice here there's a type or a where clause in here, and I have a group by statement. So it's important to notice this. Before we go on though, let's just focus on the yellow state here. Notice that the columns that I have are the state column, and then I have the sum of the sales column over here. But there's only a single column, which is state, right here. And over here, I have that single column. So a row returned by a group by is a summarization of that column as identified in the group by clause. We're going to look at that in just a moment here. The only columns that can be included in a selects field list is one listed within the group by, so it's kind of reversed. One says if you have a particular column within your select, you have to put that in the group by, and this just reverses it and says if you've got it in the group by, you have to also put it up in your individual columns up above. Now let's jump back over, and I want to assess what's happening within our data here. Let's take a look at how this statement right here actually runs. Now the first thing that this statement does when it parses it is it notices that there's a whereby clause. And basically that a where clause, not a whereby, a where clause. And what that where clause says is only look at records that have a team of Seattle and a year of 2014. So it's going to start at the very top of the data set, which is all these all the baseball records that we have, and it's going to look at the very first record and says, is it Seattle and is it 2014? If it isn't, it's going to jump over it and go down to the next record. When it finally hits a record that matches a Seattle 2014, then what it does is it grabs out next only the last name column and the first name column, and it stores it. And it continues through that entire group until it's pulled out all of the last names and all of the first names that match that where clause. And at the same time, I should mention, I need to back up, it did pull out the last name, the first name, and it also pulled out the salary. So there was actually 3 columns coming back that were stored up in memory. Then the next thing that it sees is that there is a group by statement in here. The moment it sees that group by statement, it now takes all of the last names and the first names and it groups them together. It makes sure that all the Joneses are together and all the Smiths are together and all the Johnsons are together. And then it also continues on and makes sure that all of the Dave Joneses are together and the John Doe Joneses are together, etc. So it groups everything together, and they have, in this particular case, they're always going to be grouped by the first name and the last name. Now, as soon as it does that, from that group, it then sums the salary that exists within that group. So if you look at the data down below here, there is a Franklin and a Nick that were grouped together, right? Once they were grouped together, it grabbed all the Franklin Nicks. Now, in fact, in this particular case, there's only going to be one, but it didn't know that when it did it, okay? Because it's going to be a one-to-one match here. But it grabbed all those out at that point, and when it did that, it just summed them together and ended up with a a sum over here. If I did an average right now, I'm still going to get the same number back because it's just grabbing a single year. So the average of 151 or 510,200 is 510,200. That's also the minimum. It's also the maximum within this particular list the way it is set up. So let me back up a little bit and let's take a look at baseball. But what I'd like to do is I want to group all the players right now from the city and the state that they live in. So let's talk about technique of how I might do that. So I know how to group them, but I also want to know how many that were counted. So I want to know how many are from Spokane, Washington. I want to know how many are from Denver, Colorado, that type of thing. So the way that I started off with is just to understand what I have to do is I just simply write out the columns as they might appear. So what I want is I want the city, okay, I want the state, and then I want to know the number of people from that city and state. So I'm just going to put the number here. Now, when I look at this particular thing here, I have to ask myself, which one of these are columns and which one of these are going to be aggregate functions? And right off the bat, I can see that city and state are columns, and this is going to have to be an aggregate function. So it's telling me quite a bit right off the bat. So let's go ahead right underneath this, and I'm going to go ahead and turn that into a comment. Hyphen hyphen makes it into a comment. And then down below here, I'm going to write my select statement out, or at least I'm going to start it. So let's go back in and open up baseball tables and players. And so I've got, we're gonna use the birth city and the birth state to start off with, and it's going to come from the players table. So let's just do that to start off with. So let's do a select birth city, and if we're going to do it like I have it above, let's call it city. Okay, I want birth state, and let's we'll call this one state just like above. Okay, and we'll do from players. Well, let's just take a look and see what happens right now. Right here. Uh-oh, what's mine? Oh, no mistake there. Finally saw it. Let's execute this. So what I end up with is in top to bottom, I'm not seeing what player this is. I'm not seeing the player out here, but I know that whoever's in the list, if I do this, in fact I can prove that. Let's do a select star from players. Okay, if I run this guy, just to prove what is happening here, let's make sure we understand this. Okay, first guy's from Denver, Colorado. And that's what I'm seeing right here. So I would expect to see a lot of other Denver, Colorados down below, and in fact, here I see two different Mobile, Alabamas. So what I want to do, first of all, is let's go ahead and let's order this. So let's order it by birth city. Let's do birth state first. Let's put all the states together, and then birth city. Now, some of you might have thought, gee, Tom, you could have taken that easier route. The easier route says, remember, in the order by, because it happens after the statement is already created and the date is gathered, and then it reorders it, I don't have to type in birth state and birth city. What I could have done is simply typed in city and state. But I'd already typed this in, so let's stick with what we've got right now. Let's run this. And you're going to see then I get all the nulls that are popping up at the top. And the first one is where I've got a null for the city and the state, and then the rest of them is that we know where the person was born, but we didn't know the state. These appear to be people who were born outside the country, if you take a look at the data down below here. So let's continue on. This is an important one too, because when we run our grouping statement in a minute, it's going to ignore all these nulls. Well, Perhaps. Let's just take a look and see what it does with our nulls, or at least it's going to deal with them a little bit differently. So what I want to do now is I want to include up here the number of people. So I want to know how many people would be, and let's just jump down below here a little bit. Get that menu off the side there. So let's see, I want to go down and see how many people, for example, were from Glendale, California, or whatever, Gatan, I don't know what that city is in California, or Garden Grove, California. I want to know how many players were from each one of those communities. So what I could do then is I could use a simple count statement, and I'm going to do that right over here. So I'll do a count, and I'm just going to count the number. Just want to know how many, and I'm just going to put the word number here afterwards. So when I run this guy now, if I check him, he says, looks pretty good, let's execute him. Now here's the challenge. It's saying you can't do this because you're combining now individual columns with an aggregate function. Do one or do the other. Or if you want to do both of them, then what we have to do is we simply come down here and we do a group by. And in this case, I'm going to group by my two columns, birth city and birth state. Just like that. Okay. Now notice how they fell first. I want all the data gathered together and calculated, and at the very end we're going to order that data. Okay, so let's take a look and see what's going to happen this time. Now you'll see that what we end up with is we end up with everything that is specifically unique. So, and it's important to understand what's happening at this point. In the slide earlier, I mentioned that there is a relationship between this group by and the unique statement. And if I come back in here and I ran this guy right here, let's do this. Okay. And then I do a distinct. I said unique a minute ago, I meant distinct. Okay, watch this. Well, except I didn't order the data. Let's make sure I order the data. Oh, gosh darn it, I made a mistake there. I want to add in birth state. There we go. And then I have to order it the same way. I think I got everything. And notice that when I do a distinct, in fact, let's run both these statements at the same time and take a look at what the difference is here. Notice that the data is exactly the same versus distinct. I am getting distinctly only, there may be 1,000 records that have no null in it. Okay, but I'm only going to get one back because that's the distinct. There may be 1,000 records that have this city in it and a null, but I'm only going to get one match back. And it's exactly the same thing up here. So these guys are coming back to me in this statement right here, distinct, right here. And then it's going to total the count. So notice right here, in fact, I should have looked at this a minute ago. There are 125 null nulls out here, 125 of them. Had I gone back in and I ran this just like this, boom, without the distinct, there are, let's get back up here, 125 null nulls. This is the raw data right here. So it's important exactly to see what is happening. Let me fix my columns here on my area. Now, I want to back up one more time and talk about how you do it. I always lay my data out first that I want. Then I go back in and I match it with the columns. This obviously can't match with a column. Okay, can't match with the column. I wanted a count in here. So I write my statement out first, then I put my aggregate function in, or aggregate functions in, and then I do my group by, and the group by will always have those columns. But now keep in mind that if I wanted my data to come back, this is where some of the weakness comes back in. If I wanted only the state to come back, I could do that. Check this out. Let's just take this out here. Or wrong one. Let's take the state out here. State. 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 And then let's run this guy. And you'll see then now I'm getting the total number of players from any respective state. So if I want to know how many players have played baseball from California throughout history, 2,216. Oops, gets in my way there. And let's go down and see Washington. Notice the inconsistency also of the data that's put in. Some data is put in with uppercase, and some are put in with lowercase. So where's Washington? Washington is going to be right here. 196 players from the state of Washington historically have played baseball. So a very, very powerful statement. Let's go back in. We'll talk a little bit more about it in the slides, and then we'll take a look at one additional feature of grouping. So here's a couple of statements that we're going to take a look at, and these are going to come back from the contribution table. And if you take a look at what we're doing here is we'd like to know, oh, this is a pretty cool one too, I'd like to know by state what was the donation amount made. So I'd only want to know, in the past I might have gone back in and said, you know, give me the sum of the donation amount where the state is equal to Washington, and I would have known what Washington was. But what I'd really like to do is within my data set, I'd like to have it say Washington total amount. In fact, I'd like to have all the states listed out. In this particular case, they're not going to order the states, but let's just take a look at what each one of these statements will do. So let me pull it off of the slide. Let's copy that first one. In fact, let's copy them both out as long as I'm here. And we'll go back in and play with these guys. So I'm going to go ahead and close out both of these. I guess I could leave that guy open, paste him in here, make sure that I'm going to the contributions table, or excuse me, database, and everything looks good there. So I think let's start off by spreading these out a little bit. I'd like to lay it out like this so we see it a little bit clearer. So the first thing we've taken a look at is we'd like to have something that comes back with something like Washington, and we'd like to know the total amount was, you know, like $934,999, something like that. So them all listed out by state. Now this is not ordering them, so we may not get our states back in the proper order, but we'll take a look at that and see what happens here. At worst case, we'll have to come back in and put an order by clause on it. So we've got it coming back by state. We're having it sum the donation amount as the donation, and it's all coming from the table donations. And what we're going to do is group by state. We have to put that in there. If we didn't, we could run individually. We could run a select state as donation, and then we could run a select sum donation amount, and basically get the same thing, but it would come back in two different data sets. By doing it this way, I get all my data returned back, and notice that it did bring it back to me, in this particular case, sorted. Let's make sure, is that because the data was put in that way? Let's find out. Let's investigate. So I want to close out baseball over here. Let's go to contributions, and let's do a select top 1,000 rows, and let's see if they're put in initially by state. And they're not. So what did we just discover? We discovered that the group by also ordered the data by state. I didn't have to go back in and put an order by clause in. Notice that's exactly what it did for me. An order by clause wouldn't have hurt anything, but in this particular example, it wasn't necessary. Now, there may be a time, though, that I don't want it to come back in exactly that same format. Now, let's go back in and take a look at if I wanted to add in city. So I've simply got a city column here. I could put city over here. Let's put a comma in to separate it out. Now let's run it and see what we get back. Notice I'm getting an error back. Why? Because I have a column included that is not in my group by statement. So I have to put that down here as well. And there we go. Let me close that menu out here. And you'll see now that the data came back. Oh, wait a minute. Now the data didn't come back in any kind of sorted format. Why is that? Because when there's more than one piece of data, I'm going to have to go back in and put an order by clause in and tell it. Let's see what happens if I did city. And city's not going to be very accurate here. Why? Well, because it's going to put Portland, Maines, and Portland, Oregons together. So let's take a look and see what this guy's going to give us. So wait a minute here. Something's wrong. Let's go back and play around a little bit. We didn't get our data coming back here in city order. Why is that? Let's go back to the very top. Oop, get out of the way here, menu. Let's go back and change that and find out what's going on here. So let's go back to state. And state. And rerun it. There's a mystery. There's a mystery. And I can't answer this question. Why, when we ran it by state, did it come back ordered? But when we came back in, we put it by city, it wasn't, when in fact we know the data is not in either city or state order. That is a mystery, which means to me that we have no choice but to go back in and include an order by statement regardless. You'd want to put an order by statement in there for consistency standpoint. So let's try one other thing here. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and delete that data out. What I'd like to do now is let's go back in and talk a little bit about, I'd like to group this by occupations. I'd like to know how many different, so I want something like this. I want the occupation for just all the donors. I want the occupation, and I'd like to know how much money and how many occupations there were. So I'd like to see here, well, I'd like to see the sum of the donations, and I'd like to know the number of the donations, something like that. Okay. So I'm going to go ahead and comment that out and reproduce that down below. I always like to lay the data out. Now, I should point out that generally your statements are going to be a little bit more complex than this, so it's going to make a lot more sense to lay it out. Something this simple you probably could just have done in your head, but nonetheless, pardon me, it's a good idea to lay it out. So now I'm going to do a select, and the field is occupation. So I'm going to do the occupation, and if I wanted to, let's just go ahead and complete the statement without the aggregate functions in. So I'm going to do that from table donations right here, something like that. So if I go ahead and list it out, it's OCCU occupations. Let's try it again. I get a whole bunch of occupations, and look at this. Here's an interesting issue here. Let me close that out. Notice in here it doesn't say null. What's telling me now is these are empty. They're not nulls. So I could do something like this. I could say where OCCU equals nothing. And let's see what it pulls up. These are all empty occupations, so it tells me that 75,000 of these nearly million records, if you look in the bottom right here, 75,268 of these nearly million records have empty occupations, but they don't have null occupations. I'm not sure why he chose to do that, because if I went back in and and tried to do averages or numerics, I could have some issues here. But in this case, we understand our data, so we can now deal with it. So getting back over here, it's going to actually sum up the number of empty strings for me when I do it. So right here, let's take out these guys here. I want to come back in next, and let's do a sum of the donation amount. Okay, and we'll just call that total. And then what I'd like to do is a count of the number of records that it sees within this particular group, and we're going to call that one count as well. Now again, notice that I've got this pink color here. It's warning me that count is an aggregate function, as you can see over here. So I'll have to run it first to make sure that it works, but if it does accept it, then we're good to go on it. So if I try to run this guy now, I'm going to get an error because I don't have my group by clause in here. So let's next add the group by, and I've only got a single group by here, and that's going to be occupation. And now let's execute that guy and take a look at what we end up with. So a whole bunch of different, let's see, there's some of these are overlapping, some of these are individual. For example, this is a specific name instead of the occupation, whereas, what do we got down here? Oh, there's a lot of particular company names in here, huh? I didn't see that in this data. Let's take a look at this. Huh. Where occupation, like, and let's look for somebody in here. Let's do someone that is a teacher, someplace that says teacher. And let's see what's going on here. I have this out of order here. Yeah, let's try this. I have a slide coming up here in just a moment, folks, that will tell you exactly the order that we follow. And here we go. So notice that these are all of the occupations. There's 1887 of them over here total, but these are all the occupations that have teacher somewhere embedded within their name. Kind of cool statement. So let's continue back again. Did we run the second one? I don't recall if we ran the second one. Let's come back and grab it just for the heck of it. See what it's going to do for us. What kind of magic. Oh, now this is a good example because in our order by, we can order by any column that exists within our output data. Now, this is the hard way. Let me show you again why. So again, what we're doing is we're looking at the states from the largest donation to the smallest, and it doesn't surprise you that states like California, New York, Texas are at the top. Look at even the small district of Columbia, small as they are, they're within the top 12 right here. But again, notice what I was allowed to do. I was allowed to order this time because it's included within this column list by that column right there. Now, the fact of the matter is I did it the hard way because the column was named donation. I should be able to do this and get the same thing back. So 6 of one, half dozen the other. Which one of the two techniques I just showed you was right, which is wrong? They're both right. So again, it's important that you understand that this data, when it comes back to you as the programmer, so let's take your hat off now, and you're receiving this data as the programmer, not as the person that developed a SQL statement. You're just receiving back a data set. Again, there is no difference between a simple select statement, whether it's an aggregate function, whether or not it's grouping. They're all going to be exactly the same as far as receiving program. It's just going to see data that comes back with a column header at the top and data down below, whether it's a single column and a single record as a single aggregate function, or it could be a complex information. It could be a join statement that we'll talk about later. The program that receives it never sees the join. What they see is the data that's coming back. And we also took a look here, as it points out in this slide, that we can group by any information that's in our column list or our output list. Here's the slide that I told you just a moment ago about. We've got the select, that's the first item, then we've got where, a from followed by the where, and then we have our group by statement. Now notice that we have this statement called a having statement. We're going to take a look at this having statement in a minute here. It's very, very powerful, and it's somewhat related to the where statement, but a little bit different. So let's talk about it. First of all, when you want to assess a group of data, you're going to want to use a having statement. What happens is the where statement assesses the record as it's being pulled. Think of it that way. You've got to think of the statement of the process of how that data comes out. The where statement is the very first thing it looks at when it parses that problem out, when it's looking at the record. It then grabs that record out and only the columns that the field list has in it at that point. Okay. So the where statement is at the moment the data is retrieved. So we're going to find that both the having and the where statement are going to be used to select data out. But the having statement is going to happen after the data is grouped, and we could use those groups of data within our having statement, whereas the where statement is at the very beginning. So let's understand the steps of that given this statement above. So what I've got here is I've got a group statement, and we're going to come back and we're going to pull all the states out, and we're going to sum the sales from that state where the order date was greater than January 1st of the year 2000. Now we want to group that data together by state. And then we've got this statement we've added right here at the very end, the having statement. And the having statement says, only give me those groups back that have in their sum of their sales column a value of greater than 10,000. So how does that work? Okay. Well, if you take a look at the way the slide works here, you have all your data over on the left-hand side. That cylinder represents your database, or excuse me, your table in this particular case. So the where data is going to look at what data is going to be assessed, and it moves all that data back, groups 1 through 6, and it groups everything together in this particular case. Okay. Then once those groups are put together, and it's determined now what the sum of those sales are for every group, only those groups that have a sum of the sales greater than 10,000 will be shown based on that having statement. So you cannot use an aggregate function in a where clause. Now I want to make sure we understand what it's saying here. Notice that in this particular case, I cannot use within a standard where clause a aggregate function. In this top X'd out one, you'll see it says where the sum of the sales is greater than 10,000. It can't do that because remember, that where clause is the very first thing it's pulling, and it's looking at records. And it can't look at a record and determine sum of sales. So that's not a possible statement. You're going to get an error off of it. What you really want to do is you want that data to be assessed, as you see in this bottom example here, where we've got the sum of the sales put up, we've got the state along with it, and then what we're doing, we group by state, but now we're saying only show us those groups that have sales greater than 10,000. Let's jump over and take a look at an example of something like that. So notice here that we've got our statement out here, and everything. This is the one we just did a moment ago, and I've got all my states here ordered by those states that make the largest donation, those down to the states that make the least donation. That guy is irritating. Okay, so then notice that as far as states go, the looks like, is that Virgin Islands? Is that right? I think that's Virgin Islands. North Dakota, Montana. These are the low density states, low population states that made it. I'm going to go ahead, and what I'm going to do is pull that order by statement out here. Okay, so let's rerun it again. And now I'm getting all the different donations made, and what I want now is I only want these groups listed that have a donation amount greater than, let's say, looking at this number here, let's say I want those greater than $5 million. Okay, so let's write that out right here. I want a having statement, and I want to have a sum of the donation amount. That's what I wanted to look at. Having sum of the donation amount greater than 5, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, right here. And let's see what ends up happening. Let's check it. It says it's good. Let's execute it. And we're going to see now that there were 31, we can see it. Let's get that out of here. There were 31 different states or provinces. These are all states that had donations greater than 5 million. Let's change that to 10 million and see what we end up with. 10 million. And we see it's now dropped to 23 different states. Let's jump it to 20 million. Let's narrow it down each time a little bit further. 12. 12 different states had a total donation amount in that respective year of this table exceeding $20 million. So you see how it worked in here was it did this first. Boom, it did all that. And then from that list, the having statement says once everything is done, okay, then only include those greater than $20 million. Look at this. We've got California that is what? Greater than 102 million, is that right? No, yeah, $102 million. Wow, pretty heavy duty. So that having statement is very, very powerful, but it's different. So you've got to think it's similar to that where clause, because if I went back in here now and I added a where clause in here, and if we take a look at the slides, let's take a look at our slide here before. So you see that the where clause goes, the order by clause is the very last thing. After all that data is managed, it's then going to order the columns based on what we've got left. But the where clause is going to go right after the from statement. So let's go back in and jump in here. And if I wanted to come back in here and say where, and I could put, my gosh, I could put anything in here. Let's say where the occupation, and notice that I don't have to have it in my output, at least so far. Let's find out if this is going to work. Where the occupation is like teacher. Came out with no data match teacher. Oh, well, no date. So what? This is an interesting one. So what it did is it grabbed all the teacher records. We've got to get this out of here because that's what's causing the problem right there. Let's grab this stuff first. And you'll see this is what the teachers donated, or anybody identified as a teacher donated it in any respective state. None of those, though, exceed $20 million is what the problem is. Let's say all those that exceed, let's try, pardon me, $28,000. Two states. Pardon me, that exceeded that. Now, if I wanted to have the occupations listed, check this out. See if this works. If I put the occupation up here, then I'm going to group also by the occupation. Now, the problem is it's going to give me every type of occupation out there. Watch this. That would be of type teacher greater than 20,000. I'm not going to get anybody again, because none of those groups now, look at it's now going to group all of these types together. But it's pretty interesting how it works. A very, very, very powerful statement, folks, and you just need to sit down and you need to analyze it out, because once you get this one down, this is one of those big road bumps that you need to get through. Let's jump back to the slides here. I think we're getting pretty close to the end. So hopefully this statement makes sense here. You'll see that the where clause, you understand at this point now the where clause can't do anything with aggregate functions. It can do only what individual records. It looks at only the individual record that's coming back. And again, you cannot use a where clause, something like this particular case, a where pay grader, that's not going to work because it's looking now for some kind of grouped pay, and it's not going to find that as well. That one's going to fail. We've talked a little bit about this one already. The having statement is found with the group by clause. So you're never going to ever have a having statement, as you saw on this one, without a group by statement. The group by and the having statements have to go hand in hand. And what you're going to also find is the having statement also will use the aggregate function, or one of the aggregate functions that were included within your select statement up above. You're not going to have an aggregate function in your having statement that was not included up in your list as well. And this just talks a little bit about using a combination, which we did a moment ago, of the where clause and the having clause. So hopefully I've kept your attention and you understand the having clause, you understand how it fits into the group by clause, and more importantly, you understand how to format one of these group by statements. We'll have plenty of practice for us to work on.